So let's see how Web API 2 has added support for cross-origin resource sharing. Back here in the Web API config, let's add support for CORS, as I'll continue to call it instead of calling it out as cross-origin resource sharing. The idea behind CORS, if you're not that familiar with it, is simply the concept of allowing other websites to call into your web APIs. By default, it expects that only calls from either your API or a non-website, like a mobile app, are going to be supported. Browsers typically limit this cross-origin resource sharing unless you do some handshaking with the original website to make sure that you have rights. And this is where the CORS support in Web API 2 comes in, because it's a pretty common need. To support this, you're simply going to call a configuration method called enable CORS. Now when we first add this, it's going to show us that there is no method called enable CORS, and that's because it is separated into its own NuGet package. So if we look for CORS here, we're going to see the ASP.NET cross-origin support. And then we're going to see the Web API 2 cross-origin support. This is what we're actually going to install. And that'll bring in both this as well as the basic ASP.NET cross-origin support. And now we'll see that that actually gets built. But CORS isn't enabled yet. It's only allowing you to enable it on specific calls. So let's look at our new stats controller and let's decide to add it here. We can do this with a new attribute called enable CORS. And that's going to be in this new system.web.http.cors. And here we're going to give it 3 strings. The first string is going to be the origin that is supported. So I could say that I'm only going to allow foo.com to get at me, or I can also say star to say I'm going to allow anyone to get at me, which is often the case. You can also specify which headers are supported, and again you can use star for all or an empty string or null to not allow any of the specific headers. And this is to enable you to say things like X our app in order to force whoever is going to make the call into including a header into your application. I'm going to say it doesn't matter what headers are there, and then finally what methods. And here I could say get and post if those were the only operations I want, or again if I want all I can just say that. In our case I'm just going to say get because we only have gets. I don't want them to add more rights than I actually want to allow them to have. If I enable it at the controller level, it's going to allow it for the entire controller. I could also do this at the route level if I want to allow it just for some specific methods. Or the reverse of that is also to disable CORS. And this will turn it off for specific calls in your API. So depending on whether you want to be inclusive or exclusive, you can kind of decide which mix of these makes the best sense for your implementation of CORS. In some cases, you don't want to have to go across the entire application and add these. So I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to allow our entire API to support CORS. And the way we do this is actually to come in here and say, we're going to create a new instance of the enable CORS attribute, and we'll need to bring in the namespace for that. And this attribute's the same as what we would have put on top of each of the controllers or on the specific methods. So it has the same rules that you're going to need to specify. And then you pass that attribute in. And this is going to use this attribute on every controller automatically. So in this case, when we build it, we're now going to support CORS just by adding these 2 very simple lines. Though we do have the power of using the attribute directly to control what is going to be supported by CORS and what isn't. Make sense?